Hello, this is Eric Weinstein. I'm going to be recording a short introduction to this episode because I think it's probably the most important episode of The Portal to date. That said, under normal circumstances, I probably would have either edited this heavily or not released it at all. It starts off quite slow and it gets quite awkward before finding its pace. Now, what's going on is that the interview subject is none other than my brother, Brett Weinstein. In Brett's case, you probably know him, if you know him at all, as the heroic professor who stood up against what can only be described, and I swear I'm not making this up, as a Maoist insurrection at an American college in the Pacific Northwest, the Evergreen State College. It was a very strange situation because somehow the national media that we would normally have thought would have covered such a story, for example, the media that covered the takeover of Straight Hall at Cornell in the 60s, that media was almost absent completely. At least they were absent for a very long time before they entered late in the game. And why is that? Because the story ran counter-narrative. That is, the students at the Evergreen State College who were behaving in a racist fashion were actually students of color. And this was an exactly counter-narrative story. And Brett, who stood up to this racist insurrection, was in fact somebody with a history of standing up against racism. He had in fact been a student at the University of Pennsylvania, my alma mater, an Ivy League school, and had had to leave because of death threats when he stood up for women of color who were being abused for the amusement and the sexual amusement of white fraternity students. So Brett was supposed to be familiar to many of you from an old national news story, and he was also the hero of a book called The Taper's Morning Bath. But somehow the news media, who chose not to report on the Evergreen story, was not very interested either in figuring out who Brett was because the stories showed that there was a contradictory problem with the main narrative. In some sense, that's going to be recapitulated in this episode. There is an official narrative about what happened in the scientific episode, and there is a narrative which I think is much closer to the truth, which I happen to be one of a very small number of witnesses to this alternate story. Now, the key question is whether to tell the story or not. And you're going to see that both of us have a certain amount of trepidation and energy around the question of whether or not to break a long-standing public silence. When Brett found himself as professor in exile along with his wife Heather Hying, I had thought that the American biology establishment would realize that one of their own had been thrown overboard as jetsam, and that he would have been invited to many universities to give seminars in biology. And it took a while for me to understand that because he was found at the Evergreen State College, the people who taught at highly ranked research universities thought that Brett was something more like a teacher rather than a researcher. In fact, he had been the top student of one of the most important evolutionary theorists in the United States, Richard Alexander at the University of Michigan, as well as a student of Bob Trivers, formerly of Harvard, arguably one of the greatest living evolutionary theorists, I think presently at Rutgers. Brett was somebody who had actually done really interesting work in his thesis, and for some reason, the system found it very disturbing to consider the full implications of his work. I think in this episode, we're going to do something interesting. I see Brett in two separate ways. On the one hand, I view him as a very heroic figure, and he's an absolutely brilliant person. It's been a pleasure sparring with him throughout my life. However, I'm also his older brother, and you're going to hear me at sort of my overbearing best, browbeating him a bit. Now, the point isn't to push him down, but quite the contrary. I'm rather competitive as Brett's older brother, and I don't want to compete with the weakest version of Brett, the professor in exile. Instead, I want him seated again inside of the institution where he always belonged. And in order to do that, I want him to tell the tale not with embellishment, but as it actually happened, because I think it's one of the most fascinating episodes in modern biology that I've ever heard. So I hope that you like it. We're going to put it in front of you as an experiment, and we're going to test to see whether or not I'm correct that the portal can be used to augment the usual channels. I believe that a lot of us are sitting on intellectual gold. I don't think that the story that somebody's work didn't see the light of day or got attributed to somebody else is as exotic as the institutions would have you believe. In fact, I think it's quite common. I think many of us find that we don't have careers inside of science because something goes wrong quite early when we're quite vulnerable. And my hope is that some of you listening, who I know are struggling as graduate students or as postdocs or as undergraduates, will listen to this and find some courage to stand up for yourself. Because quite frankly, if you choose not to do it in order to make nice with your fields, the chances are you probably won't have a career in the long term. You might as well swing for the fences, and you might as well clear your throat and tell your story as it actually happened without fear. I don't know that this is going to succeed, but we're going to run an experiment, and I think both Brett and I are up for it to find out wherever it goes. The one thing I would say is that if anyone else in the story wants to tell their version of events, it would be an honor to have you on the portal. There are no bad people in this story, in my opinion. There are a lot of bad incentives. And if we're going to actually fix this system, we're going to have to look past the interpersonal. But the point of this, in my opinion, is that I think it's sufficient to open the case again and to seat Brett Weinstein inside of the university system, that is the research university system where he has always belonged. So have a listen, and I hope you like it.